Hi, this is David from over at SimplyMaya.com. Now, I've received this very nice interior scene from one of our forum members who's having a slight issue adapting to the new color management workflow. So I thought I'd run you through the way I do it, taking files from an older workflow with gamma correct nodes and lens shaders and adapting those over to Maya 2016. Now, I've had a quick look through this file and a few things strike me that could do with optimizing, especially for test rendering. So I'm going to just run through some optimizations for a scene like this first off. Now, the first thing I noticed was we're using an 11K HDR. Now, this is a very, very big image. So it's going to add time to the calculation of the render, especially in Maya 2016. And all we're using it for is really to bleed a little light color into the room here. So it's not necessary to use such a massive image, and it will increase render times quite significantly. Now, I've had to remove this HDR. In fact, it's so big that it was slowing my viewport down to the point where Maya had just stopped. So a better way to do this is, if you're using your HDR this big and this sharp because you want to see the trees and grass and whatnot through the window, a better way to do it is to composite a background image in later on. If you don't want to go to that trouble, I'd suggest you put an environment sphere in here, or even simple polygon plane with a high resolution shot outside the window and make that invisible to final gather. So if you were to take a look at the geometry here and go under render stats and mental ray, you can find transmit and receive final gather. Turn those off and final gather will go straight through that reflection card outside, or that background card. So the best way is to composite it in. If you don't want to go to that trouble, you can use an environment sphere or a flat plane, but what you really don't want to do is use a massive HDR that's having to calculate light and information. It will make the render slower. So I'm going to load in the kind of HDR I would use for lighting, which is a fairly low-res blurred image, and I'll just show you what that looks like. Okay, so here is something I would use. Now, this is just a very low-res blurred HDR image. It still does have the super brights in it, so this will actually produce a bright light. And I'm just going to move it in the direction of the window. So I'm going to line it up with the sunlight the same way the original HDR was. Now, this will produce a much quicker render. So if we go back into the main room, and I go back to the main render cam, you can see this will give us the same. The only difference is that we will have a different reflection outside the window. But as I say, use a polygon plane out there, use a circular environment that's not casting light, or comp it in later on. All of these are better options than having a huge 11K HDR that's actually casting some light out there. So once that's done and you've simplified that process, I'm going to take a look in the render settings, and for me, we're using importans and irradiance particles here, something I've always been a fan of, but for a test render I'm going to disable them. So I'm going to turn off the importans and I'm going to turn off the irradiance particles. Now, I've always been a fan of these GI workflows in the past for very specific shots, but right now Maya has a new GI prototype which will give you about a very similar result to rendering with irradiance particles and importans, but it's faster. It's still slower than Final Gather at the moment, but hopefully they're going to lend a little GPU acceleration to that. But for right now, Final Gather will be good enough, especially for test renders. And if you want that extra bump in quality that irradiance particles and importans bring, then try the new GI. Okay, so for right now, Final Gather. So let's go down and look at the settings, which I believe are set pretty well for a test render. So we just find Final Gather in here. And 30.1, 5 bounces. Let's check the tracing, 5, 5, and 10. I'm going to set the Final Gather caching to automatic. In fact, if you want a brute force Final Gather now, you can just go Final Gather Force here. But for testing, this is not a bad start. There is a lot of secondary bounces, but that shouldn't slow us down too much. So now we've got that. I got a lighting quality of 0.5 and an overall quality of 0.5. I'll probably bring that down to 0.25 just for the testing. Okay, and now we should be able to get a test render. Let's just check the size here. I'm going to stick this to a standard HD 520. So all we've really done so far is turned off the importans and irradiance particles for testing and blurred that HDR image out. We still have no color management on this. Let me just pop open the preferences window. Oops. Let's try that again. There we go. So our color management is turned off, and we should have a lens shader on our camera. Let's just check that has been connected. So, mental ray, there isn't a lens shader. I am going to make an assumption now that there was one in here at some point. And there we go, MIA, simple exposure. So let's throw that back on. And as we can see, that's had some of its settings tweaked. But let's just get a render of this and see what sort of render time we're looking at. And with color management off, we'll get a render to save so we can then turn the color management on. Okay, so here's the render with the old color management. Now obviously this is not looking quite as good as it should. We've got very low quality GI and low quality settings overall, but this should be good enough to see if the new color management matches the old. So the first thing we do is break the lens shader from the camera. So I'm going to break the connection with that. Then we need to change all these gamma nodes. Now we don't want to be here for a year and a day, so let's just go up to the outliner, unclick show DAC objects only and search for gamma, and let's try a star at the end. There we go, and this gives us all our gamma correct nodes. Now for now I'm just going to turn these all to 1, which will just pass through, just give a gamma of 1, so we won't be turning it up or down. We could delete them all and reattach the diffuse textures, and you probably should, but this is a quick way to just change them. And in fact I can just select them all, go up to Window, General Editors, Attribute Spreadsheet, grab all those gamma values, set them all to 1 in one fell swoop, and that will give us a gamma of 1 on everything, or indeed just a pass-through. Won't change the texture at all. I'll then need to go into the Hypershade and just look through the textures. So we'll just, if we grab something we know has a texture on it, sorry this is not my scene so I'm not quite as familiar with it as perhaps should be. I'm going to make sure that the color management is set right. So on a color we've got a gamma pass through 1, won't affect anything, and then we want to make sure the color space is set to sRGB, which it will be by default. So if I look at another one just to double check, so diffuse color, go in here, make sure color space set to sRGB. You're going to need to go and check any reflection maps you have. For instance, you don't want to correct those, so you go in and set these to raw, and the same with any bump maps. So if you've got a bump map on any of these things, there is one, you're going to want to set that bump to raw. So basically anything with a color that we're going to see as the viewer, that needs to be corrected. Anything that Maya's using internally to work out a reflection or a bump needs to be set to raw. Okay, so now we've done that, we need to turn on the color management. And let's just go to preferences here. There we go, color management, flick on the color management, make sure we are working correctly. So let's just check this is all set right. So we've got a rendering space in linear and a view transform sRGB, and that seems about fine. Now you'll notice our render has gone completely washed out. That's because it's now had gamma applied. If we go to raw, you can see what it used to look like. Okay, so let's leave that. Our viewport has also had the gamma correction applied. So that should be all that's necessary to do a render, and we should get something that looked pretty much like this. So let's have a look and see what we get. Okay, so that finished rendered out with a render time of about 4 minutes, so it's pretty acceptable for the lighting and whatnot we've got here. Got a lot of reflections on surfaces and stuff, so it's not surprising that it's taking about 4 minutes. Now I have here a picture that you put up in the forum, and of course it's being double gamma corrected, so let's flick it back to raw. But here was your image with importans and irradiance particles and some of the other elements in the scene. And here is the color managed image. So I have to flick this to sRGB. So they're pretty similar. I'm afraid I can't tell you why you were getting those white hotspots when you did this, but if you follow this way of doing it, you'll get back to an image that's very similar. Now, your original render had a better GI solution with the importans and irradiance particles, or at least it had a different one. But in terms of color management, we're pretty much about there. Now, if you wanted to move on from importans and irradiance particles, we can try Maya's new GI system. So I'm going to flip open here. Let's see, go from Final Gather to GI Prototype. Now, you might want to turn the material quality down a bit for this. And also, with the HDR under Maya 2016, we used to emit light through a HDR. If I took emit light and then use legacy, and this was just basically a huge pain in the backside and never worked very well, if you'll excuse me. The new emit environment light works very well. So I'm going to do you a quick test render now with Final Gather off and GI on. Now this will be slower. It will be faster than importans and irradiance particles, but still Final Gather would be the way I would go if I needed fast shots. But anyway, let's have a look. So on with the GI prototype, on with the emit light. We've got the color correction workflow going for us. We've got all our gamma nodes removed or set to a factor of 1 so they have no effect. And I'm going to render and we'll see what that looks like in comparison to this one. Okay, so here's rendered with color management plus Maya's new GI prototype. And if you look at some of the shadowing here and the darkening within the draws, we've got a much better GI solution. In fact, this is the original with importans and irradiance particles. And I think this GI solution is a little better. So, you know, depending on the look you're going for, this looks more natural to me with the amount of light coming in and what's being shadowed. Now, you may need to bump up the intensity of your lights, depending on what you're going for, but this looks fairly natural to me. Now, it did take 7 minutes as opposed to 4, but again, for a final render, you know, you might be willing to spend that little bit of extra time. So I hope that helps you. As I say, I couldn't see how you managed or how those bright spots occurred when you changed from no color management to color management, but as you can see from this run through, it didn't happen here. I think part of it may be the HDR you were using. It becomes, you know, a little problematic to do the importans, irradiance particles and such a large image for the render. Now the machine I'm using only has 16 gig of RAM and a consumer grade graphics card, a GTX 660 I think it is, so it could have something to do with the image was simply too large for this particular machine. But realistically, if we swap this out now for a more higher res image, you're not going to get much of a different color bleed pushed in, and you are going to get a longer render. So anyway, I hope that gave you some insight into color management, and I hope this helps. If not, or if you still have any questions, just throw them in the forum thread and I'll try and get to them. Cheers. Thank you very much for watching.